Good afternoon, y'all. Today, I'm going to talk about slavery in the South and the abolition movement. So, after y'all, I would suggest you watch the other video and do all the reading first, and then come back to this one if you haven't done the reading. But basically, there's a couple things I want to look at. Firstly, when we're looking at the Old South, and whenever we say the Old South, that means the South before the Civil War. The social system of the Old South was very hierarchical, based on hierarchy. So there were a very few people in the South who were extremely wealthy. I think it's the 12 wealthiest people in the country lived in the South, and I'm pretty sure the two wealthiest people in the world also lived in the South. But most of the South was poor. Most people were poor. The people who were wealthy had all the power. They were the ones who owned plantations and slaves. They controlled politics. They controlled the social system, culture, everything. So a lot of the poor whites living in the South were not in a great situation. They were poor and they didn't have any political power. Yes, they could vote, but the people who ran the local government were the wealthy people. So a lot of times people wonder, like, why did poor whites support slavery? They didn't own slaves. Slavery was really bad for them. Slavery was bad for a number of reasons. One, because it made certain people extremely wealthy. Slavery made plantation owners have enormous wealth, and that gave them the power to control the entire community. That wasn't good for poor whites. They also were sort of at the mercy of the plantation owners, even if they worked for them or didn't work for them, they still relied on them. A lot of times they would need to use borrow their tools. They would need to store their grains or other crops at the plantations. So they were sort of connected with the plantation owners economically, but the fact that plantation owners used slaves for their labor meant that poor whites really didn't have a lot of employment opportunities. They couldn't compete with slave labor. Who would want to hire a poor white man when you could just buy a slave and make that slave work and do whatever you wanted them to do? So the system of slavery was really bad for poor whites. It kept them poor. It allowed them no opportunity for economic advancement. So why did they support it? There's a couple of reasons. One, because slavery put them above someone else. Slavery made them not be at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Remember, this is a culture based on hierarchy. Everyone had their place. And as long as slavery existed, poor whites were not at the bottom. It also gave them power. Slavery gave them power over other people, power that they wouldn't have had otherwise because they were the poorest. So it basically allowed them to control another group who was lower than them. Poor whites also supported slavery, many of them, because they hoped that one day they'd be able to own slaves, or that maybe one day their children would be able to own slaves. So they didn't want to see slavery end because they kept thinking, like, well, if I make it one day, I can live like this plantation owner, which would never happen. But it just gave them something to strive towards. So the fact that most Southern whites supported slavery was one of the main reasons it lasted so long, because if poor whites had not supported slavery, they could have joined together with slaves to sort of overthrow the system. But this was the fear. This was why the wealthy people wanted to make sure poor whites supported slavery, so that they would not help slaves and they would not partner up with them in order to help them, like, revolt. So both slaves and poor whites were sort of kept in their place through this system of slavery. You'll read in the chapter and you'll see in the American History Crash Course a lot of information about Southern culture, about slave culture. A lot of it is really painful to read. So I just kind of wanted to mention one thing that slaves did to maintain their autonomy in some sense. They didn't have freedom of their bodies. They didn't own their own bodies, which is one reason I want y'all to read that Frederick Douglass 4th of July speech. It's one of the most famous speeches in American history. So with this very limited power that enslaved people had, one thing they could do was sort of keep a culture alive. And things like stories, folk tales, poems, songs became very important as a way to sort of keep a culture alive. And these things were not, you didn't have to write them down. You could tell these stories and they would, you know, their children would tell the stories and their children would. And with songs, you could just, you know, sing the songs. So you didn't have to necessarily write down a history. You could just transmit your oral history through songs and stories. And one of the most interesting things that I found about slave songs, spirituals, were, especially after the Underground Railroad started to become known, slaves would often, in their songs and in their stories, they would often give information on how one might escape slavery. So if you hear a lot of these slave spirituals, they mention the River Jordan a lot, and they could sing about that openly because it's from the Bible. So the slave masters would not get suspicious and think that they were talking about escaping. They would think that they were just, you know, singing songs about the Bible. But whenever enslaved people talk about the River Jordan, that I shouldn't say whenever they talked about it, because sometimes I'm sure it was just a reference to the Bible, but many times the River Jordan symbolized the Ohio River, which was the river that separated slave states from free states. And so if you could cross that Ohio River, you could be in a free state. So many of these songs, they would give instructions basically on how one might cross over the River Jordan. And most slaves knew that that meant the Ohio River. So pretty interesting. And a lot of slave folk tales have a distinct theme in which a weaker, smaller animal outsmarts or outwits a stronger animal to get out of a dangerous situation, like the Brer Rabbit. And that became a common theme in slave oral culture. Basically, somebody who's really witty and really intelligent and really good at talking can get themselves out of a situation by outsmarting someone who's stronger than them. And you can see, I think this is really interesting because even nowadays with rap music, and rap music is definitely not limited to African Americans anymore, but African Americans did create rap music and rap culture. And part of that is being verbally, having a talent for words. A lot of times they're freestyling, they're just coming up with it on the spot, and they're using their superior like verbal talent to outwit someone else. You back in the day, like you would have like these two rappers and they would sort of like try to outdo each other by coming up with the most like creative thing to say on the spot. So it's still this legacy of having sort of that skill in being able to talk your way out of something or to outwit someone verbally. I think that's really interesting that it comes from like a lot of these slave folk tales in which they sort of symbolize like a slave having the upper hand because they are able to outwit their master. So of course they don't really have the upper hand because they're still a slave, but many times they would get away with things because they could sort of talk their way out of it or fool their master, trick them or something. So that's the theme you see in a lot of these oral histories. So wealth in the South was extreme. I guess that was all I need to say about that. I'm looking at my notes of things I need to talk about. So when we look at American culture in the mid 1800s, it was a time of like a lot of reform movements. A lot of different people were coming up with ways to fix American society or to escape from it. So you have the Mormons as an example of a group of people who were trying to escape from American society. Many times these people were unhappy with the changes that were brought in by the market revolution. So they were unhappy with like wage labor, factories, capitalism, and they were trying to sort of figure out a better way. So sometimes they would just separate themselves from American society and create like their own separate communities, like utopian communities. And other times different like people would try to fix American society. So you see all these movements for things like ending alcohol, movements for public education, movements to improve the lives of prisoners and mentally ill people. So, and abolition is the biggest one of those. It was obviously a movement to end slavery. So the mid 1800s is like a time of reform in American culture. And there were a group of, sorry, they were building a house next to mine, and it's kind of loud, sorry about that. But there were a group of like writers in the mid 1800s known as transcendentalists. And I find this group of people interesting because they were pretty rebellious against like American culture. They were pretty unhappy with this idea of like factories and trains and big cities and industry. And most of them just kind of wanted to return to like nature. Excuse me. Two of the most famous of the transcendentalists were Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, actually three, I'm going to name three, and Emerson. So in looking at Henry David Thoreau, he wrote a document or an essay called Civil Disobedience. And we're going to talk about this next week because it was in direct, it was in opposition to the Mexican-American War. But I bring it up here now because this chapter kind of covers the transcendentalist writers. And in Civil Disobedience, he argued that if there's a law that's unjust, it's our duty to break that law in a peaceful way. So this became the backbone of the civil rights movement in the United States and of the movement for Indian independence from England. Basically, this idea of nonviolent protests where you break the law, but in a nonviolent way. So civil disobedience. And this is important when we look at abolition because a lot of white abolitionists were able to sort of use civil disobedience as a way to fight slavery. Black abolitionists were not able to do that. They did not have as many rights as whites did. But another, when I say Black abolitionists, I mean free Blacks. Another really important idea that these transcendentalists came up with, especially Henry David Thoreau, is the idea of tyranny of the majority. And I think this is really important. So democracy is based on majority rule. And the United States is not a pure democracy, and we never have been. And I actually think that's a good thing, and I'm about to tell you why. This is what Thoreau was saying. We are somewhat of a democracy in America. Some things are done by majority rule. And Thoreau was saying that we can't rely on majority rule. It's not the be all end all, like perfect way to make decisions, because when the majority makes all the decisions, you have tyranny of the minority. And specifically, Thoreau was looking at slavery, saying, oh, if everything is majority rule and all these states vote on whether or not they want slavery, of course it's going to be yes, because like a lot of, the majority is voting in favor of slavery. Regardless of the fact that African Americans and slaves couldn't vote, so we're even only talking about the white vote, it would still be, obviously a very high percentage of people who would vote in favor of slavery. And so Thoreau was saying, just because the majority favors it does not mean it's morally correct or morally good. And so he began to bring up this idea that we can't just rely on majority rule. We have to have protection of the minority. And this was specifically related to slavery, but we can see how this idea impacted so many other things. And when I said that we're not a pure democracy in America, what I mean is, we're a republic. Not everything is majority rule. We have a constitution. So if tomorrow, if there was a vote just hypothetically, if they put, on the ballot when you vote for president, if there was a question that said, do you think that um, all people with red hair should be banned from the country? And the majority of people said yes. It still can't happen because our Constitution protects minority rights. Now it does. Our Constitution protects there's especially the 14th Amendment. It gives people equality before the law. So in a pure democracy, everything is based on majority rule. But in a republic, you have a combination. You have like the votes, but you also have certain things that can't ever happen. We can never have slavery again because the 13th Amendment outlawed it. So whether or not the majority wants it, it will not happen. And this is why I think it's good that we're not a pure democracy. And this is what Thoreau was saying. We can't rely on the majority to make all the decisions. That leads to tyranny of the minority. A lot of opponents of slavery began to be more active during the mid 1800s. And many of them were arguing that, of course, slavery is wrong ethically and morally, but they were also saying slavery is making the South really violent. It's a culture of violence. And if you can't have slavery without violence, because how else are you going to force someone to work 16 hours a day in the sun and be separated from their children and, and undergo like terrible punishments? The only way that system would work is with violence, with the threat of violence. So a lot of anti-slavery activists were saying slavery is just bad for a person's ethical and moral standing. It makes them a violent person, which obviously, yes. They were also arguing that slavery was making America undemocratic. Our political system was being threatened by slavery. And here are a few examples. And this was actually mentioned in the last chapter about Andrew Jackson, but in the mid 1800s, around 1830s, 40s, 50s, a lot of abolitionists began to send out abolitionist material through the mail. So they would send out pamphlets, like thousands of pamphlets about how bad slavery is and about like the torture and just the heartache of it. And they would send these to people in the South by the thousands, perhaps even the millions. And Southerners did not like this one bit. So they started interfering with the mail system. They started destroying abolitionist material as soon as it hit the post office so that it wouldn't be distributed to the people in the community. And as you guys probably know, that's a federal crime. You can't interfere with the mail. And now this is an issue with regards to voting, but still, it's a federal crime to interfere with mail. You can't destroy mail and prevent it from being delivered. But that's what proponents of slavery were doing in the South to prevent abolitionist material from reaching people. A lot of pro-slavery people were also often encouraged the kidnapping or even the killing of abolitionists. So people like William Lloyd Garrison, there were posters throughout the South that offered like thousands of dollars for anyone who could bring him to the South. And they were like, bring him alive. Don't kill him first. Bring him alive so we can kill him. So there were ransoms put on people's heads like Garrison and other prominent abolitionists. So basically you have people in the South encouraging kidnapping. And this happened a lot, surprisingly. So Northerners were saying, gosh, now Southerners are basically encouraging the kidnapping of, our citizens. Like, what's going on? And another example was in Congress. There were a lot of abolitionist proposals brought to Congress until many Congress members in the House decided, or actually in the Senate, they decided, we don't want to hear any of these proposals for ending slavery. So they created the gag rule, and that meant that any abolitionist proposals that reached Congress would automatically be tabled. They would automatically be disregarded. They wouldn't be considered. They wouldn't be read. People in Congress were not given the opportunity to hear them or vote on them. So this is obviously not how the political system is supposed to work. So Northerners and others who were against slavery were saying, gosh, slavery is really corrupting our entire political system. Now we have the Senate basically refusing to hear valid proposals, and they're not even considering them because the South has so much power and they're able to institute this gag rule. So another example of the way that it's kind of infiltrating the political system. Many defenders of slavery became a lot more adamant about defending slavery because abolitionists were becoming more active in trying to end it. And this made pro-slavery advocates more aggressive and more active. And they began to come up with like different ways to justify slavery. John Calhoun, who was a South Carolina congressman, and then he was Secretary of State and Secretary of War and almost president, he started to argue that slavery, he said slavery is, quote, a great good. So prior to the mid 1800s, people would generally argue that slavery was a necessary evil. So somebody like Thomas Jefferson, he would say, well, I don't love the idea of slavery, but we need it. It's a necessary evil. And maybe one day we won't need it anymore, but right now we need it. And then later, like 30 years later, you have someone like John Calhoun saying, no, it's good. Slavery's good. It's good for everyone. It's good for the slave owners, of course, because, they're able to grow wealthy. It's good for Southern society because the South is able to grow in wealth, which we know wasn't distributed among everybody. But he also argued that slavery was good for slaves. And this is the part that just always makes me roll my eyes. Like, that he actually argued that. He said slaves they don't have to worry about being unemployed. They don't have to worry about where they're going to get their next meal. They're given housing and clothing. And so it's good. And he was arguing that the slaves in the United States they're so lucky to be here because they're living so much better than people in Africa were living, which is just ridiculous. But he was arguing that like we've actually benefited them by forcing them here and by putting them in this system because they're taken care of. And he began to call slavery a peculiar institution. And in many ways, he was saying like it's unique. It's part of our unique Southern culture, and we should celebrate it. So again, really different from the pro-slavery, the supporters of slavery back in like Thomas Jefferson's day, when they acknowledged that maybe slavery was not great, but they argued that we need it. So you see now this shift where they're saying no, slavery is good. Defenders of slavery also used the Bible to justify slavery, and they would pick out certain passages in the Bible that deal with things like obedience and having like the people below should obey and respect the people above them. Things like that, they would really pick out and say, look, the Bible supports slavery. And the sad thing about it is the Southern churches supported slavery. Like there was no active movement among churches in the South against slavery. And I'm not trying to say that every single person who went to church supported slavery, but I'm sure it was very, very close to every single person. And of course, I'm not talking about African Americans. But the church system, the actual messages that the churches would put out were completely in support of slavery. They supported it fully. Supporters of slavery would also use the Constitution to argue that slavery is protected by the Constitution. And in particular, they would use the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment calls for protection of life, liberty, and property. And just remember that prior to the Bill of Rights, the phrase was life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But during the Constitutional Convention, Southerners insisted that pursuit of happiness be changed to property because They were defining slaves as property, and they wanted the Constitution to protect their property. So the Fifth Amendment was changed to say life, liberty, and property. And so Southerners were able to say the Constitution protects the institution of slavery. The federal government cannot ban it because the Constitution protects our right to our property, which they defined as slaves. So you might be wondering, well, if the Fifth Amendment protects life, liberty, and property, then how come the slaves didn't have protection of their life and liberty? Well, it's because they weren't considered American citizens. They didn't have constitutional rights. The week after next, we're going to look at a court case that deals specifically with this idea of whether or not the Constitution extends to African Americans, and the Supreme Court said no, it doesn't. So they weren't considered people with constitutional rights, and so that's why the Fifth Amendment didn't protect their life or liberty. Proponents of slavery would also argue that the slave system in the South was more humane than the factory wage labor system in the North. And they would argue that, so slave owners would say, like, our slaves, again, they don't have to worry about unemployment. They don't have to worry about food or shelter. All that is provided for them, and there are employees for life unless they get sold, which they didn't mention that often. But they would basically say, kind of make the argument that they're part of the family. We provide for them. Whereas in the North, factory workers making barely enough to survive on would work, probably less than slaves, but too many hours, and they could be fired at any moment, and they would not have food or shelter guaranteed for them. They were sort of out on their own, out in the cold, which, that wasn't great either. But I think it was fairly ridiculous for Southerners to argue that slavery was better than the wage labor system in the North. At least with the wage labor system, you could work your way up. At least you own your own body. You could quit your job if you wanted. You weren't going to get whipped. You weren't going to get raped or separated from your family. And you could possibly work your way up the ladder. That was not a possibility with slavery. One last thing I want to mention, the majority of active abolitionists were women. And we're looking at like the 1830s through the end of the 1850s. About 2/3 of active abolitionists were women. And when I say active, I mean people who were actively working for abolition, not just people who were personally against slavery. So women made up the bulk of abolitionists. And there were two effects of this. So one is that when women started speaking out against slavery, they were often told, like, you're a woman, you shouldn't be speaking in front of people. That's not your place. And so women became more political. Women who were abolitionists decided, like, I'm told that I can't even have a public voice, but I'm adamant about ending slavery because it disrupts families, and my job as a woman is to protect the home and the family. So if I want to have a voice in this fight against slavery, I need the right to vote. So the abolitionist movement made more women more actively engaged in winning the right to vote. They wanted to use it to end slavery. They also began to say, wow, I don't have rights either. Like it's not as bad as a slave. I'm not as bad off as someone who's enslaved, but I don't have the right to go out and speak. People aren't listening to me. They aren't taking me seriously because I'm a woman. Excuse me. So more and more women became feminists while they were becoming abolitionists. They felt like, well, if I'm going to speak to end slavery, I'm also going to speak for women's rights. So they tended to tie those two issues together. And if you take American history 2020 next semester, this will come up again. But being an abolitionist made more women politically active. The women's rights movement that began to develop alongside the abolitionist movement had an effect on the abolitionist movement. So women were demanding more rights, some of them, and they would join abolitionist groups, and within those abolitionist groups, some people would say, no, within our organization, women do not speak in public. Women do not have an active role. You can sit there and listen. You can, make coffee or whatever, but you can't be like a leader of this movement. And so, in some ways, women split the abolitionist movement in two, because there was another side of the abolitionist movement led by people like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, and also William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. And they supported women's rights. So you have this side of the abolitionist movement that's like, nope, no women can have an active role. And then this other side where women were actively encouraged and supported. And these people, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and the Grimke sisters were supporting women's rights at the same time that they were supporting abolition. And they tended to tie those issues together. They would talk about the rape of enslaved women, and they would, say that's a women's rights issue. They would talk about babies and children being separated from their mothers, and they would make that another women's rights issue. So they kept those two conversations linked. And one major abolitionist group supported women's rights and one didn't. So the women question kind of split up the abolitionist movement, but it also linked up women's rights with abolition. I hope that makes sense. All right, well, we'll end there. Thanks for listening.